was he was a really, really, really smart man, and I tried some things on this film that weren't near as successful, but the one thing where I was actually able to impress him was actually a post-production thing. The scene you see in where we're in the van is actually a very truncated thing right here. It's a much larger scene because you see the robot putting himself back together, and there's voiceover stuff that goes on between myself and Fisher Stevens, who's playing the Indian scientist guy. And what had happened was we shot that up in near Seattle. We actually shot it in Portland, and it was shortly after Mount St. Helens had happened. And one of the things we did was we went up to Mount St. Helens, and my friend G.W. Bailey, who's also in the film, I don't know why I'm pointing there, he's not there, but just in case any of you were looking and expecting to see him. But we drove up, and when we got to the top, Fisher was there with a lady that he was having a relationship with at the time, and was very distraught because he'd rented a car and he'd driven up, but he was from New York, so he knows how to drive. The answer is no, in case anybody's wondering. And he had driven off the side of the road, because it's a one-lane road going up to the top of the mountain. And he'd taken two of the wheels of the car off the rims. And they had one spare, which was a donut. And they thought, well, it's a nice place to spend the rest of our lives. We'll build us an ash hut and we'll make it work. And so Bailey and I, in essence, took over and went around asking some people and everything. We found another gentleman who had a tire that fit, and so we put those on, and we drove back down, and everything worked out. But when we shot the film, we just had a short speech, and it's interrupted by the scenes which they shot later of the robot assembling itself. So there would be, you'd hear a little bit of dialogue, and then you'd be this gap of silence, a little bit of dialogue. So we were going back in to do looping, which is where you go in and do dialogue to be put up on the screen. And I called in to the editor and said, give me the amounts of time between these pieces of speech. And he did, so I wrote, so I could say in that amount of time, the story of Fisher being up on top of the Mount St. Helens and sort of planning to spend the rest of his life there. And when we went into loop, I didn't bother to tell Fisher that this is what we were doing. And so he was a little, what? And then he realized what it was, and it was fine. And Mr. Badham was there, and he had some stuff for me, and I said, well, I did some stuff at home. And he said, oh, well, I guess I don't have to do anything. And I didn't know how to take that, but when we were done, he did say thank you. So if you watch the film and you listen closely, you'll hear that story.
And I just wanted to mention, in the Santa Claus sequence of Santa 85, you got to work with one of your favorite character actors, Pat Hingle, which is something I think is remarkable. As we're watching these clips, Marvin's personality, his look, his mannerisms, everything changed from character to character. And you really admire people like Pat Hingle that you worked with. And we've got a segment coming up with Charles Durning, who's one of the great character actors.
Pat Hingle is one of those guys that, if you, well, even if you don't act, but I mean, if you act and somebody says Pat Hingle, you go, oh yeah, I'd like to work with him. And you do, and it's really good. He was the original Big Daddy in Cat on a Hot Tin Roof on Broadway, and is in a ton of other things, and has a really terrific part, strangely enough, in a Clint Eastwood film, and I don't remember if it's Hang 'em High or
Hang 'em High. He's the judge that just wants to hang all the criminals.
Yeah, and it's just terrific to watch him because he does one of those performances where he's not like a evil guy. He's just this evil guy.
Well, we're going to see a clip of Charles Durning, and you were telling me that Charles Durning is one of those character actors. He's still alive. He's still working. He's just fascinating. When he becomes the character, you don't see Charles Durning. You said when you looked into his eyes, you saw the character.
Well, one of the things, again, actors prefer, because you usually get to know the people you're working with in the scenes and in rehearsals and everything, and you chat while they're setting up the camera and all this. And one of the things you prefer is when you get on shooting in the scene, is when you look at them, you don't see the person looking back at you. You see the character looking back at you, which sounds obvious, but there are cases when it's unfortunately not what happens. And I have no idea what the people who look into my eyes say. But it was one of the wonderful things about Charles is you could talk to him, you could be talking to him right up to when the director says action, and as soon as the director says action, it's there. And it was really quite a thrill and a wonderful experience to work with him. He's a great guy and a great actor.
Richard, can we look at the next batch of 3 clips from 3 different films, starting with the Charles Durning scene from Kenny Rogers' The Gambler Part 3. Then we're going to move on to Return of Horror